The champagne had barely stopped flowing when Vivian Hart destroyed her husband's life in front of 300 of Crown City's elite, and she did it with a smile. Grant Halston thought tonight would be his victory lap, arriving at the Horizon Hope Gala with his mistress on his arm while his wife stayed quietly at home. He was wrong. Vivian had spent months planning this moment, and when she finally took that microphone, every lie Grant ever told turned into a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. This is the story of how one woman turned betrayal into power and made sure the whole world was watching. If you want to see how this unfolds, stay until the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The Orchid Palace Hotel didn't just host events, it curated experiences for people who measured their worth in zeros and influence. Tonight's Horizon Hope Gala was the crown jewel of Crown City's social calendar, a glittering spectacle where fortunes were pledged, alliances were forged, and reputations were either cemented or shattered. The ballroom itself was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from soaring ceilings like frozen waterfalls, each table dressed in cream silk with centerpieces of white orchids flown in from Singapore that morning. Servers in crisp white jackets moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, offering champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. Grant Halston stood near the entrance to the main ballroom, his hand resting possessively on the small of Lola Reyes's back. He cut an impressive figure in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, salt and pepper hair styled just carelessly enough to suggest he had better things to think about than appearance, though anyone who knew him understood that every detail of Grant Halston was meticulously calculated. At 52, he'd built Halston Industries from a mid-tier real estate firm into a development empire that had reshaped Crown City's skyline. Buildings with his name on them pierced the clouds. Politicians returned his calls. Men envied him. Women wanted him. Or so he believed. Lola glowed beside him in a crimson dress that hugged every curve. Her dark hair swept into an elegant updo that showcased the diamond earrings Grant had given her last month. A gift she'd accepted with the kind of grateful enthusiasm Vivian had stopped showing years ago. Lola was 29, ambitious and beautiful in that sharp, hungry way that made men feel powerful for having captured her attention. She worked in marketing at a boutique firm that occasionally contracted with Halston Industries, a professional connection that provided just enough plausible deniability for their very unprofessional relationship. "Everyone's staring," Lola murmured, her lips curved in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let them," Grant replied, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequences. "You look stunning. They're jealous." But even Grant, wrapped in his armor of ego and entitlement, couldn't ignore the quality of the stares tracking their movement through the room. Something felt different tonight. The usual admiring glances held an edge he couldn't quite identify. Conversations seemed to pause and restart as they passed. Smiles were too bright, too fixed, like masks that might slip at any moment. Margaret Chen, wife of the city's comptroller, approached with champagne in hand and mischief in her eyes. "Grant! How wonderful to see you. And Lola, isn't it? That dress is absolutely fearless." "Thank you," Lola said, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Will Vivian be joining us tonight?" Margaret asked, her tone as sweet as antifreeze. "I haven't seen her in ages. Such a shame she misses these events." Grant's jaw tightened. "Vivian wasn't feeling well. She sends her regrets." "What a pity." Margaret's eyes sparkled with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. "Well, I'm sure the evening will be memorable regardless. If you'll excuse me, I simply must say hello to the Vandermeers before the program starts." She glided away, leaving Grant with the uncomfortable sensation of having missed the punchline of a joke told at his expense. "That was weird," Lola said quietly. "Margaret's always been a gossip," Grant dismissed, but his hand had unconsciously moved from Lola's back to his phone, checking for messages with the paranoia of a man who'd built an empire on knowing things before everyone else. Nothing unusual. A few business emails. A text from his chief operating officer about a zoning variance. The normal machinery of his life operating exactly as it should. So why did his instincts, honed through decades of boardroom battles and hostile negotiations, keep screaming that something was wrong? The ballroom continued to fill with Crown City's power elite. Senator Michaels worked the room with practiced ease, his laughter booming over the string quartet playing Vivaldi near the stage. Tech mogul James Wu stood in a tight circle with his venture capitalist friends, no doubt dissecting startup valuations between sips of 30-year-old scotch. The Riverside Country Club set clustered near the bar, their plastic surgery and inherited wealth creating an almost uniform appearance of ageless privilege. Grant had climbed into these circles through sheer force of will and ruthless intelligence. Unlike most of the people in this room, he hadn't been born to wealth. His father had owned a small construction company that went bankrupt when Grant was 17. He'd worked his way through state college, started with nothing, and built everything through calculated risks and an absolute refusal to accept limitation. That hunger, that drive, had carried him to heights these trust fund dilettantes could never understand. It had also made him certain that he deserved whatever he wanted, including Lola, including this night, including the freedom to live exactly as he pleased while his wife stayed quietly in their Riverside mansion, playing her role as the perfect CEO's spouse. Vivian had been perfect for him once. When they'd married 23 years ago, she'd been the daughter of Harrison and Catherine Hart, old money with deep roots in Crown City's founding families. The Harts had owned textile mills, shipping companies, real estate, generations of accumulated wealth that Vivian had inherited along with the poise and social fluency that came from being raised in that rarefied world. Marrying her had opened doors Grant could never have accessed on his own. Her family connections had secured the financing for his first major development. Her presence at his side had legitimized him in circles that still cared about bloodlines and social registers. But somewhere along the way, Vivian had become background scenery in his life. She ran her charitable foundation, attended her committee meetings, maintained the household, and asked nothing of him except his presence at occasional social obligations. She'd become so thoroughly accommodating, so reliably pleasant, that Grant had started to find her boring. When had she last challenged him? When had she last surprised him? When had she last made him feel anything at all? Lola, on the other hand, made him feel alive. She laughed at his jokes, admired his accomplishments, wanted him with an intensity that Vivian had stopped showing years ago. Being with Lola was exciting, dangerous, validating in ways his marriage had ceased to be. The fact that keeping her secret required an elaborate architecture of lies, canceled meetings that never happened, business trips with suspiciously sparse documentation, a downtown apartment leased through a shell corporation, only added to the thrill. "Mr. Halston," a photographer from Crown City magazine approached with professional enthusiasm. "Mind if I grab a shot for the society pages?" Grant's media training kicked in automatically. "Of course, Lola. Actually," the photographer interrupted, his smile never wavering, "I was thinking just you, if that's all right. We're doing a feature on this year's major donors." Lola's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her clutch, but she stepped aside with practiced grace. Grant posed alone, his expression arranged in the confident smile that had graced 100 magazine covers, while the photographer took several shots from different angles. "Perfect," the photographer said, reviewing his camera's display. "Thank you, Mr. Halston. Enjoy the evening." Something about the exchange left Grant unsettled, though he couldn't articulate why. The photographer's professionalism had been impeccable, but underneath it Grant sensed something else, a knowing quality, as if the man were documenting evidence rather than capturing a social moment. "You okay?" Lola asked when the photographer had gone. "Fine," Grant said shortly. "Let's find our table." They were seated at table 3, close enough to the stage to signal importance, but not at the head table reserved for the gala's primary sponsors and board members. Grant frowned at this. He donated $100,000 to Horizon Hope last year. By rights, he should have been at the head table, or at least at table 2. His table mates arrived in a steady stream. Richard and Pauline Vandermeer, whose pharmaceutical fortune dated back 4 generations. Thomas Wu, the tech mogul's younger brother who ran a successful chain of upscale restaurants. Jennifer Park, a prominent architect who'd designed 3 of the city's most acclaimed buildings. And Martin Chen, Margaret's husband, whose position as city comptroller made him simultaneously powerful and perpetually anxious about the appearance of impropriety. The conversation flowed easily enough. Discussion of the upcoming mayoral election, speculation about interest rate changes, complaints about the traffic nightmare created by downtown construction. But Grant couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was performing, hitting their marks in a play whose script he hadn't received. "I heard the program tonight is supposed to be quite something," Pauline Vandermeer said, her jeweled fingers toying with the stem of her champagne flute. The organizers have been very secretive about the details. Probably another one of those video presentations, Richard grumbled. Last year they made us watch 20 minutes of heartwarming testimonials before we could eat. I don't mind, Jennifer said. The work Horizon Hope does with homeless youth is remarkable. If sitting through a presentation gets more funding to kids who need it, I'm happy to watch. Spoken like someone whose contribution gets her name on a building wing, Thomas laughed, but his tone was friendly. The lights dimmed slightly and a hush fell over the ballroom. Grant checked his watch, 8:45. The program was starting 15 minutes late, which was unusual for an event this meticulously planned. Then the main ballroom doors opened again and every head turned. Vivian Hart entered like a force of nature contained in human form. Grant's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen his wife in 3 days. He'd told her he was in Seattle for a conference, when actually he'd been at the downtown apartment with Lola. And in that time, she seemed to have transformed into someone he didn't quite recognize. She wore a gown of molten gold that caught every light in the chandelier-lit room, the fabric draped and structured in a way that was simultaneously classic and utterly modern. But it wasn't the dress that commanded attention. It was everything else. The Hart family jewels adorned her throat and wrists, emeralds and diamonds that had been worn by her grandmother at her debut in 1952, pieces that existed in museum collections and insurance company nightmares. Her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant chignon that showcased the architectural beauty of her face, high cheekbones, intelligent gray eyes, a mouth that could convey warmth or withering disdain with the subtlest shift. But more than any physical detail, it was her presence that dominated the room. She moved with unhurried confidence, acknowledging greetings with gracious nods, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She looked like royalty, not the modern, approachable kind, but the old-world variety that expected deference and received it without question. At her side walked a man Grant recognized immediately, and the sight of him sent ice through Grant's veins. Damon Klein was Crown City's most feared corporate attorney. He didn't handle divorces or personal injury cases. He orchestrated hostile takeovers, defended executives in securities fraud trials, and had a reputation for destroying opponents so thoroughly that settlements usually came within days of his involvement, his adversaries preferring surrender to the alternative. He was in his early 50s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of controlled intensity that made even innocent people nervous in his presence. And he was walking beside Vivian with the easy familiarity of a close colleague. "Oh my," Pauline Vandermeer breathed. "Is that Damon Klein?" "It is," Martin Chen confirmed, his voice tight. "I had to deal with him during the Transit Authority restructuring. The man is absolutely ruthless." Grant's mind raced through possibilities, each more alarming than the last. Why was Vivian here? Why was she dressed like that? And why had she brought Damon Klein? Lola had gone very still beside him, her champagne forgotten. "Grant," she whispered. "Who is that?" "My wife," he said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. The color drained from Lola's face. "Your wife is here? You said she never comes to these things." "She doesn't," Grant said, his eyes never leaving Vivian as she made her way through the room, stopping to speak with the Riverside set, accepting air kisses from women who probably loathed her behind their smiles, shaking hands with men who'd tried and failed to be anything more than professional acquaintances. And then, impossibly, Vivian began walking directly toward their table. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs. His mind cataloged emergency responses: denial, misdirection, charm offensive. But before he could deploy any of them, Vivian arrived at table 3 with Damon Klein at her shoulder like a particularly expensive weapon. "Grant," Vivian said, her voice warm and melodious, as if they were the happiest couple in Crown City. "What a lovely surprise. I wasn't sure you'd be back from Seattle in time." The trap of it was perfect. If he acknowledged the Seattle lie, he'd have to explain why he was here when he told her he'd be out of town. If he didn't, he'd look confused about his own schedule. "Change of plans," he managed, rising from his seat with automatic courtesy. "The morning meetings got canceled, so I flew back last night. I would have mentioned it, but I didn't want to wake you when I got in." "How considerate," Vivian said, and something in her eyes, a flash of dark amusement, made Grant's stomach clench.
And you must be Lola Reyes. I've heard so much about you. Lola stood shakily, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mrs. Halston, it's nice to meet you. Please call me Vivian. She smiled with perfect, terrifying warmth. That dress is absolutely stunning. Marchesa, isn't it? The fall collection? Yes, Lola stammered. How did you? I have an eye for these things.
Vivian's gaze traveled over Lola with the clinical assessment of an expert appraiser examining a piece of questionable art. The construction is exquisite, and those earrings are lovely. Cartier? Lola's hand flew to her ear, touching the diamonds Grant had given her. Yes. Beautiful taste. Vivian turned to include the entire table in her radiant attention. Good evening, everyone. Pauline, Richard, always wonderful to see you. Jennifer, I saw the photos of your new library project. Absolutely magnificent. Thomas, Martin, gentlemen. She nodded to each in turn, receiving murmured greetings that sounded distinctly nervous. Vivian, Pauline Vandermeer said carefully, we didn't expect to see you tonight. What a pleasant surprise. I almost didn't come, Vivian admitted, her tone conversational and light. But Damon convinced me it would be worth attending. You all know Damon Klein, I assume? The attorney offered a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good evening. A chorus of uncertain greetings answered him. Damon Klein at a charity gala was like finding a shark in a swimming pool. Technically possible, but a sign that something had gone very, very wrong. Well, Vivian continued, we should find our seats. The program will be starting soon, and I have a feeling tonight is going to be quite memorable. Grant, Lola, enjoy your evening. She swept away toward the head table, Damon following in her wake, leaving a silence so profound that the string quartet seemed suddenly too loud. Thomas Wu was the first to speak. Did that just happen? That, Martin Chen said slowly, was the most terrifying display of good manners I've ever witnessed. Grant had reached for his water glass without realizing it, needing something to do with his hands to disguise the fact that they wanted to shake. Vivian knew about Lola. Of course she knew. How could he have ever thought otherwise? His wife wasn't stupid. She'd probably known for months. The question that made his blood run cold was, what was she planning to do about it? Lola leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. Grant, I think I should leave. No, he said sharply, then moderated his tone when Jennifer glanced their way. If you leave now, it looks like we're running. Just stay calm. This is probably just Vivian making a point. She'll give me hell about it later, we'll negotiate some new arrangement, and everything will go back to normal. Even as he said it, Grant didn't quite believe it. Nothing about Vivian's entrance had suggested a woman preparing to negotiate. She'd looked like a general surveying a battlefield, confident in victory before the first shot was fired. At the head table, Vivian had taken the seat beside Eleanor Jameson, the executive director of Horizon Hope. The two women leaned together in conversation, Vivian listening intently to something Eleanor was saying, her expression engaged and sympathetic. She looked completely at ease, utterly in command, as if she'd planned every detail of this moment. Because she had, Grant realized with dawning horror. His wife, his quiet, accommodating, thoroughly predictable wife, had orchestrated this entire evening. The lights dimmed further, and a spotlight illuminated the stage. Eleanor Jameson rose from her seat and made her way to the podium, her smile broad and genuine. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Horizon Hope Gala. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for your continued support of our mission to provide housing, education, and support services to Crown City's homeless youth. This year, we've helped over 300 young people find safe housing and job training, and we couldn't do it without your generosity. Polite applause rippled through the room. Grant barely heard it. His attention was locked on Vivian, who sat perfectly still at the head table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and attentive. Before we begin our program, Eleanor continued, I'm delighted to announce a very special donation that came in just this afternoon. One of our longtime supporters has decided to make a truly transformational contribution, one that will allow us to open a second facility on the north side, doubling our capacity to serve young people in need. The room stirred with interest. A major donation announcement was always the highlight of these events, a chance for the wealthy to signal their virtue while securing naming rights and tax deductions. This donor has asked to make the announcement personally, Eleanor said, stepping back from the podium with an enigmatic smile. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Vivian Hart. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, but Grant heard it through a rushing sound in his ears like standing under a waterfall. No, this wasn't possible. Vivian had her foundation, her committee work, her carefully controlled charitable budget that he monitored because it technically came from their joint accounts. Vivian rose from her seat with fluid grace and walked to the podium, accepting the microphone from Eleanor with a warm smile. She waited for the applause to subside, her gaze sweeping the room with the assured timing of someone who'd spent a lifetime commanding attention when she chose to. Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you all for being here tonight, Vivian began, her voice clear and strong. I've supported Horizon Hope since its founding 12 years ago because I believe that every young person deserves a safe place to sleep, a path forward, and adults who refuse to give up on them. The work Eleanor and her team do literally saves lives. More applause. Grant's hands gripped the edge of the table. Tonight, Vivian continued, I'm honored to announce a donation of $5 million to Horizon Hope to fund the opening of the Northside facility and to establish a permanent endowment for their job training programs. The ballroom erupted. $5 million was a staggering sum, more than the total of all other donations tonight combined. Heads turned toward the head table, toward Vivian, processing this new understanding of her wealth and influence. Grant's mind reeled. $5 million. Where had that money come from? Their joint accounts didn't have anywhere near that liquid capital. She must have liquidated something, stocks, bonds, maybe even real estate from her family trust. But how had she done that without him knowing? He monitored her accounts. He'd insisted on it when they married, a prenuptial agreement that gave him oversight of her inherited wealth in exchange for her receiving shares in Halston Industries, shares that she controlled, he realized with a jolt of pure panic. This donation, Vivian said, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts, was inspired by someone who taught me an important lesson about honesty. Someone who showed me, quite clearly, that I'd been living a lie, and that the truth, however painful, was infinitely preferable to comfortable deception. The ballroom had gone very quiet. This was no longer a standard wealthy person thanking other wealthy people speech. Something else was happening. Lola Reyes, Vivian said, her gaze finding their table with laser precision. Would you please join me on stage? Time seemed to stop. Lola's face had gone absolutely white. Around their table, expressions ranged from shock to barely suppressed excitement, the kind of anticipation that preceded spectacular social disasters. Go on, Vivian encouraged from the stage, her smile never wavering. Don't be shy. Every eye in the ballroom was now locked on table 3. Lola looked to Grant with desperate, pleading eyes, but what could he do? Refuse would be an admission. Going along might limit the damage, might allow him to control the narrative afterward. It's fine, he heard himself say. Just go up there. Lola rose on shaking legs and made her way to the stage, her crimson dress that had seemed so glamorous an hour ago now marking her like a target. The walk couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, but it felt eternal. She climbed the steps to the stage, and Vivian greeted her with another warm smile, taking Lola's hand as if they were old friends. Thank you for joining me, Vivian said, her voice kind, her eyes absolutely merciless. I wanted you here because you played such a crucial role in helping me see clearly. You see, for the past 7 months, Lola has been having an affair with my husband. The collective intake of breath was audible. Lola made a small, wounded sound. At table 3, Pauline Vandermeer's hand flew to her mouth. Vivian continued, her tone still pleasant, still conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. I've known for quite some time, of course. Grant isn't nearly as clever as he thinks he is. The Shell Corporation for the apartment downtown. I serve on the board of the bank that approved the loan, the business trips to Seattle. His assistant sends me his actual calendar. She's a lovely woman named Patricia who's worked for me for 15 years and only started working for Grant because I asked her to. Grant felt the room tilt. Patricia, his competent professional assistant who handled his schedule, his appointments, his travel arrangements.
She'd been reporting to Vivian the entire time. At first, Vivian said, I was devastated. 23 years of marriage, and it came to this. I cried. I raged. Considered the usual options: confront him, file for divorce quietly, pretend I didn't know, and live in polite fiction. Her expression shifted slightly, something harder crystallizing beneath the gracious surface. But then I realized something important. I didn't want to confront Grant in private, where he could spin it, manipulate it, make promises he'd never keep. I didn't want a quiet divorce where we'd both pretend to be civilized while lawyers divided assets. And I certainly didn't want to keep pretending I was blind to something everyone in this room probably suspected. She paused, letting that land. Guilty glances flickered around the ballroom. Of course they'd suspected. Crown City's elite traded gossip like currency. So instead, Vivian said, I decided to do something I've never done before. Tell the complete truth publicly and let the consequences fall where they may. Grant, darling, her gaze found him across the room. You should probably pay attention to this next part. Grant's entire body had gone cold. Around him, the ballroom seemed to contract, 300 faces turning his direction with expressions ranging from shock to poorly concealed satisfaction. He forced himself to remain seated, to keep his face composed, even as everything inside him screamed to run, to stop this, to do something, anything, to prevent what was clearly about to happen. Vivian stood at the podium like a queen pronouncing judgment, one hand resting lightly on Lola's trembling arm, the other holding the microphone with absolute steadiness. The stage lights caught the emeralds at her throat, making them flash with green fire. I want to be clear about something, Vivian continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. I'm not doing this out of spite or revenge. I'm doing this because I spent 23 years making myself smaller, quieter, more convenient for a man who mistook my grace for weakness. I organized his life, raised his profile, opened doors he could never have accessed on his own, and asked for nothing except basic respect in return. And Grant repaid that by lying to me every single day for 7 months. She paused, and in that silence, Grant heard the death of his reputation, his standing, everything he'd built. So tonight, Vivian said, I'm filing for divorce. The papers were submitted to the courthouse at 5 p.m. this afternoon. Damon? Damon Klein rose from his seat at the head table, pulling a folder from the slim briefcase at his feet. He joined Vivian on stage, his presence lending an official, irrevocable weight to the proceedings. The divorce filing is comprehensive, Damon said, his voice devoid of emotion, a surgeon describing an operation. But that's actually the least interesting part of tonight's announcement. You see, over the past 7 months, while Grant was occupied with his extracurricular activities, Vivian and I have been engaged in what I'd call aggressive asset protection. Grant's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Asset protection. The words landed like hammer blows. Halston Industries, Damon continued, is structured as a privately held corporation. Grant owns 42% of shares. Through their prenuptial agreement, Vivian owns 18%, shares that Grant insisted she take in lieu of other financial arrangements. The remaining 40% has historically been distributed among various investors and silent partners. He paused, flipping open the folder to reveal a dense document that even from a distance looked official and terrifying. Over the past 6 months, Damon said, Vivian has systematically acquired those outstanding shares through a series of private transactions. She now controls 51% of Halston Industries. As of tomorrow morning, when the stock transfer documents are filed with the state, Vivian Hart becomes the majority shareholder and controlling interest of her soon-to-be ex-husband's company. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, exclamations, a few nervous laughs from people who didn't know whether this was brilliant or insane. Grant felt the floor drop away beneath him. 51%. Majority control. It wasn't possible. He would have known, would have been notified when shares changed hands. Unless. His mind raced back through the past months, searching for clues he'd missed. The investors he'd thought were silent partners. Had they all been plants, people willing to sell to Vivian when the time came? The board meetings he'd skipped because he was with Lola. Had critical decisions been made in his absence? His certainty that he controlled his empire had blinded him to the possibility that the foundation was crumbling beneath his feet. How? The word escaped Grant's lips before he could stop it, loud enough that several nearby tables turned to look at him. Vivian's gaze found him across the room, and her smile was almost pitying. You want to know how I did it, Grant?
I'll tell you. First, I used my family connections. You remember those? The Hart family name you married into because you needed their credibility? I called in favors, made introductions, convinced people that selling to me was in their best interest. Second, I used money from my trust fund, the one you've always dismissed as old money nonsense, but which turns out to be considerably more liquid than you realized. And third, I was patient. You taught me that, actually. You always said the key to any good deal was making the other party think they were getting exactly what they wanted, right up until the moment they realized they'd lost everything. She let that sink in, her expression serene. But the shares are only part of the story, Vivian said, turning back to address the full room. Because Grant didn't just betray me emotionally, he betrayed me financially. Over the past 7 months, he's spent approximately $380,000 on his affair with Lola. The downtown apartment, the gifts, the trips, the expenses. $380,000 that came from our joint accounts, from company funds, from resources that were legally half mine. At table 3, Pauline Vandermeer made a small sound of disgust. Thomas Wu shook his head slowly. Even Richard Vandermeer, who'd been divorced twice himself under less than noble circumstances, looked appalled. The apartment lease, Damon added, consulting his folder, was signed using forged documents that listed Ms. Reyes as the primary tenant, when in fact Grant was paying all expenses through a shell corporation, Meridian Holdings, LLC, that he established using company resources without board approval. That's fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of corporate assets. Any one of those could trigger serious legal consequences. Grant finally stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every head swiveled toward him. "This is insane," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with forced authority. "Vivian, if you want to discuss our marriage, we can do that privately, like civilized people. But making wild accusations in public, dragging business matters into personal? Sit down, Grant." Vivian's voice cut through his bluster like a blade through silk. "I'm not finished." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty the command, made him hesitate. In 23 years of marriage, Vivian had never spoken to him that way. She'd disagreed, yes, argued occasionally, but never had she wielded her voice like a weapon, sharp enough to draw blood. "I have documentation," Vivian continued, pulling out her phone with deliberate slowness. "Bank statements, credit card receipts, text messages, emails, all acquired legally, I might add, since our joint accounts and the company accounts I now control as majority shareholder give me every right to audit expenses. Would you like me to share some highlights?" "Vivian," Grant said, hearing the desperation creep into his voice and hating himself for it, "please, don't do this." "Don't do what?" she asked, her eyes wide with false innocence. "Don't tell the truth? Don't show people who you really are? You seemed perfectly comfortable doing this to me for 7 months. Turnabout seems only fair." She swiped at her phone, and suddenly her voice echoed through the ballroom sound system, reading aloud from messages Grant recognized with sickening clarity. Text from Grant to Lola, March 15th. "Vivian's at some charity luncheon today. I told her I have back-to-back meetings until 8. We have the whole afternoon. Wear that black thing I like." Lola made a choked sound beside Vivian on stage. Her face had gone from white to red, mortification painted across her features. "April 2nd, Vivian continued, her voice steady and merciless. "Grant to Lola, just signed the lease on the apartment, 2 bedrooms, river view, all ours. Vivian thinks I'm investing in a commercial property. She's too busy with her little committees to ask questions." Little committees. Grant remembered writing that, remembered laughing about it with Lola over wine in that apartment, mocking his wife's charitable work as if it were a hobby she'd taken up to fill empty hours rather than meaningful work that had genuinely helped people. May 21st, Vivian read. "Lola to Grant. I feel bad sometimes. She seems nice. Does she really not know?" And Grant's response, "She knows what I let her know." Vivian spent our whole marriage living in a fantasy world where everything is perfect and proper. She wouldn't recognize reality if it hit her in the face. Besides, she's got everything she wants, the house, the status, the Hart family name on everything. She's not going anywhere. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Grant wanted to explain, to provide context, to make them understand that those messages were taken out of context, that he'd been venting, that everyone said things in private they didn't mean, but the naked truth of them, the contempt, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, made any defense impossible. Around the ballroom, the initial shock was crystallizing into judgment. Grant could see it in their faces. The Vandermeers, the Chens, Senator Michaels, all the people he'd networked with, done deals with, considered peers. They were looking at him the way you'd look at something distasteful you'd found stuck to your shoe. "There's more," Vivian said, still scrolling through her phone. June 10th, Grant to Lola. "Bought you something special. Nothing Vivian would ever wear. She's too uptight for real style. Can't wait to see it on you."
That was the Cartier earrings you're wearing right now, Lola. They cost $47,000 from our joint account. Lola's hand flew to her ears again, pulling the earrings out with shaking fingers as if they'd suddenly become radioactive. They fell to the stage floor with a small, expensive clink. "Should I keep going?" Vivian asked, her gaze sweeping the ballroom. "Because I have hundreds of messages, months of documentation showing exactly how little Grant thought of me, how clever he believed he was, how certain he was that I'd never question him, never challenge him, never do anything except stay in my place and be grateful for the privilege of his name." "Stop," Grant said, the word coming out hoarse. "Please, Vivian, I'm sorry. I made mistakes, but this, humiliating me in front of everyone, this isn't you. This isn't who you are." Vivian tilted her head, considering him as if he were a stranger making an interesting but ultimately irrelevant point. "You're right," she said quietly. "The woman you married, the woman who spent 23 years being accommodating and understanding and endlessly forgiving, she wouldn't do this. But that woman doesn't exist anymore, Grant. You killed her. What you're seeing now is who I actually am when I'm not making myself smaller for your convenience." Butch, she handed her phone to Damon, who accepted it with the same clinical efficiency he brought to hostile takeover negotiations. "The financial impact," Damon said, seamlessly picking up the presentation, "extends beyond the affair expenses. Grant has also been manipulating company finances to inflate his personal compensation while minimizing distributions to other shareholders, including Vivian. We've documented approximately $2 million in questionable transactions over the past 3 years. Add in the tax implications of his shell corporation activities, and we're looking at potential criminal exposure for fraud and tax evasion." Grant felt sweat prickling at his hairline despite the ballroom's aggressive air conditioning. Criminal exposure, fraud, tax evasion. These weren't just divorce proceedings anymore. This was character assassination, professional destruction, and the potential for actual legal consequences. "Now," Vivian said, reclaiming the microphone from Damon, "before everyone starts wondering if I'm just being vindictive, let me address that directly. I'm not interested in destroying Grant for the sake of destruction. What I want is justice, accountability, and assurance that he can never do this to anyone else." She turned to face him fully, and the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "Here's what's going to happen, Grant. Option 1, you accept the divorce terms that Damon will present to you tonight. Those terms include you retaining 25% of Halston Industries shares, enough to remain wealthy, not enough to have control. You'll sign a confession detailing the financial improprieties, which will be held in escrow and released to authorities only if you contest the divorce or attempt to retaliate in any way. You'll also agree to a non-disparagement clause, a ban on contact with me for 5 years except through attorneys, and a very quiet exit from public life." Grant's throat had gone completely dry. 25%. He'd built that company from nothing, and she was offering him a minority stake in his own creation. "Option 2, Vivian continued, her voice hardening. "You fight me. You contest the divorce, challenge the share transfers, make this ugly in court, and I will bury you. I'll release every message, every receipt, every piece of documentation to the press. I'll pursue criminal charges for the fraud and embezzlement. I'll make sure that every business deal you've ever done gets audited, every relationship gets scrutinized, every secret gets exposed. I'll spend every dollar of the Hart family fortune, if necessary, to ensure that you become a cautionary tale told at business schools about what happens when arrogance meets accountability." The threat landed with the weight of absolute truth. Vivian wasn't bluffing. She had the resources, the documentation, and clearly the will to make good on every word. "You have until midnight tonight to decide," Vivian said.
Damon will be at the bar with the paperwork. Find him before the clock strikes 12. Sign the documents, and you get option 1. A quiet exit with your dignity mostly intact and enough money to live very comfortably for the rest of your life. Ignore the deadline, and I assume you've chosen option 2, and tomorrow morning we go to war. She paused, letting the ultimatum settle over the room like fallout. As for you, Lola, Vivian said, turning to the younger woman who stood frozen beside her on stage, you have a choice too. Cooperate with my attorneys, provide testimony about the financial arrangements Grant made, confirm the timeline and details, and I'll make sure your career survives this. I have connections in marketing, and I'm willing to facilitate introductions that could actually help you, provided you're honest and willing to learn from this catastrophically poor judgment. Lola nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face, mascara creating dark trails that destroyed her earlier glamorous appearance. Or, Vivian continued, you can stay loyal to Grant, refuse to cooperate, and I'll make sure everyone in Crown City knows exactly what kind of person you are. The affair will follow you to every interview, every networking event, every professional opportunity. The choice is yours. I'll cooperate, Lola whispered, her voice barely audible over the microphone. I'll tell you everything. I'm so sorry. I never meant... Save it, Vivian said, not unkindly but with finality. Apologies are meaningless right now. What matters is what you do next. Damon will arrange a meeting. Be honest, be complete, and you might salvage something from this disaster. She gestured toward the stage steps, a clear dismissal. Lola fled, stumbling slightly in her heels, rushing past the tables of staring faces toward the ballroom exit. The sound of her sobs echoed in the terrible silence until the doors closed behind her. Vivian stood alone at the podium now, Damon having returned to his seat, the spotlight illuminating her in a way that made her look almost otherworldly, powerful and terrible and absolutely certain. I know what you're all thinking, she said, addressing the room at large. This is messy. This is uncomfortable. This isn't how things are done in polite society. We're supposed to handle our private disasters privately, smile in public, and pretend everything is fine even when it's falling apart. She shook her head slowly. But I'm done pretending. I'm done protecting men who don't deserve protection. I'm done caring more about appearances than truth. Grant didn't just betray me. He bet that I'd care more about avoiding embarrassment than seeking justice. He counted on my desire to maintain our social standing, to avoid scandal, to be the bigger person. And he was wrong. Senator Michaels, who'd been married to the same woman for 40 years, and whose political career depended on projecting family values, stood and began applauding. Slowly, uncertainly, others joined. Jennifer Park stood next, then the Vandermeers, then Thomas Wu and Martin Chen and half of Table 3, until the entire ballroom was on its feet, applauding Vivian Hart with a fervor that felt less like social obligation and more like genuine admiration. Grant remained seated, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. They were applauding his destruction. They were celebrating his wife's very public evisceration of everything he'd built. And he could do nothing except sit there and take it, because standing up, objecting, making a scene would only make everything worse. The applause finally subsided, and people returned to their seats with an energy that felt electric. Vivian smiled graciously, accepted the ovation with a small nod, and then, impossibly, returned to the purpose of the evening. Thank you all, she said. Now, I believe Eleanor has a wonderful program planned to showcase the work Horizon Hope does, and I don't want my personal drama to overshadow the real purpose of tonight, which is supporting young people who need our help. Eleanor? The executive director returned to the stage looking somewhat dazed but gamely professional. Yes, well, thank you, Vivian, for that comprehensive announcement. We do indeed have a video presentation featuring some of our success stories, and then we'll be serving dinner. As if on cue, servers began emerging from the kitchen, carrying trays of what was presumably the first course. The program continued as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis, as if Vivian hadn't just destroyed her husband in front of Crown City's elite and received a standing ovation for it. Grant finally stood on legs that felt like they might give out. He couldn't stay here. Couldn't sit through dinner making small talk while everyone stared at him, judging, pitying, enjoying his downfall. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and texted his driver. Around him, his table mates had gone very quiet. No one seemed to know what to say to him, and Grant was grateful for that at least. Any expression of sympathy would have broken something fundamental inside him. "Grant," Pauline Vandermeer finally said, her voice carefully neutral. "If you need to leave, I'm sure everyone would understand." It was as close to kindness as he was going to get from this crowd, and they both knew it. He nodded once, not trusting his voice, and made his way toward the ballroom exit, aware of every eye tracking his movement, every whispered conversation that started up as he passed. The lobby of the Orchid Palace felt blessedly empty after the concentrated attention of the ballroom. Grant loosened his bow tie, suddenly unable to breathe properly, and headed for the main doors where his driver would be waiting. "Mr. Halston." He turned to find Damon Klein emerging from the ballroom, the folder still in his hand, his expression professional and utterly unmoved by the drama he'd just orchestrated. "I have the papers here," Damon said, approaching with the inevitability of a glacier. "If you'd like to review them tonight, we can find somewhere private to discuss terms." "It's not even 9 o'clock, Grant said, his voice raw. "She gave me until midnight." "She did," Damon agreed, "but every minute you wait is a minute you spend knowing what's coming if you refuse. Most people find that uncertainty more painful than just accepting the inevitable. I'm offering you a chance to end this now, tonight, and start trying to rebuild whatever's left of your life." Grant wanted to tell him to go to hell, wanted to reject everything, wanted to fight just on principle, because accepting meant admitting total defeat. But Damon was right. The uncertainty was agony. And deep down, beneath the shock and anger and humiliation, Grant knew he'd already lost. "Where?" he asked. Damon gestured toward a small conference room off the main lobby. "In there. I took the liberty of reserving it for the evening." Of course he had. Vivian and her lawyer had planned every detail, anticipated every move. Grant had been outplayed so completely that he'd never even realized he was in a game. The conference room was elegantly appointed in the Orchid Palace style. Leather chairs, mahogany table, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars. Damon spread the documents across the table with practiced efficiency, turning them so Grant could read without having to ask. The divorce settlement was exactly as Vivian had described. 25% of Halston Industries, enough to remain wealthy but not enough to maintain control. The confession regarding financial improprieties, to be held in escrow and released only if he violated the terms. Non-disparagement, no contact except through attorneys, supervised access to any shared assets during the transition period. It was brutal and comprehensive and left him almost nothing except money, which he realized with bitter clarity was all he'd ever really valued anyway. The power, the status, the respect had all been built on foundations he'd thought were solid, but which Vivian had undermined so thoroughly that they'd crumbled the moment she'd pulled the supports away. "There's an addendum," Damon said, flipping to another page. "Vivian is willing to structure the payout of your share value over 3 years rather than requiring immediate liquidation, which will minimize tax impact and allow you to maintain lifestyle during the transition. She's also agreed not to pursue criminal charges for the financial improprieties, provided you cooperate fully with the divorce and the share transfer." "How generous," Grant said, the words tasting like acid. "It is, actually," Damon replied without a trace of irony. "She could bury you completely. She's choosing not to. I'd suggest you appreciate that distinction." Grant picked up the pen Damon had thoughtfully provided. Heavy, expensive, the kind of pen that signed documents that changed lives, and stared at the signature line. One stroke of ink and everything he'd built, everything he'd been, would belong to his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife. "If I sign this," Grant said slowly, "what happens to the company? Vivian doesn't know anything about running a business." Damon's expression suggested he'd been waiting for this particular display of arrogance. "Mr. Halston, Vivian has a degree in economics from Harvard, serves on the boards of 4 major corporations, and has managed a charitable foundation with an endowment of over $30 million for the past decade. Her little committees have taught her more about organizational management, stakeholder relations, and strategic planning than you apparently absorbed in 20 years of running Halston Industries. She'll be fine. Better than fine, actually." The rebuke landed with surgical precision. Grant had never asked what Vivian did all day, had never bothered to learn about the foundation she ran or the board she served on. He dismissed it all as social decoration, activities appropriate for a CEO's wife, but not worthy of serious attention. He'd underestimated her in every possible way, and this was the price. Grant signed.
His signature looked strange on the page, shaky in a way his writing never was, as if his hand knew this was surrender, even if his mind hadn't fully accepted it. There are several other documents, Damon said, already moving on with efficient professionalism.
The financial confession, the non-disparagement agreement, the contact restrictions, and the share transfer authorization. Each needs to be signed and initialed in the indicated locations. It took 20 minutes to work through all the paperwork, 20 minutes to legally dismantle 23 years of marriage and hand over control of everything he'd built. When it was done, Damon collected the documents, slipped them back into his folder, and stood. "The divorce will be finalized in 60 days per state law," he said. "My office will handle all communications. Do not contact Vivian directly. Do not go to the house. Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to whatever address you provide. Do not attempt to access joint accounts or company resources except as explicitly outlined in the settlement. Any violation of these terms will trigger the release of the confession and potential criminal prosecution. Are we clear?"
"Crystal," Grant said, the word hollow. Damon nodded once and left, taking with him the last shred of Grant's old life.
Grant sat alone in the conference room, listening to the muffled sounds of the gala continuing in the ballroom beyond. They'd moved on to dinner now. People would be eating, drinking, discussing Vivian's spectacular public takedown with the same enthusiasm they'd brought to discussing the latest merger or political scandal. By tomorrow, it would be the only thing anyone in Crown City talked about. His phone buzzed. A text from his driver. "Out front whenever you're ready, sir." Grant stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the Orchid Palace Hotel, past the gleaming lobby, through doors held open by staff who'd witnessed his humiliation, into the night air that felt cold despite the lingering summer heat. The car ride home, except it wasn't home anymore, was it? Passed in silence. Grant stared out the window at the city he'd helped shape, buildings with his name on them, developments he'd championed, the skyline he'd changed through sheer force of will and refusal to accept limitation. None of it mattered now. Vivian had taken everything that counted, and what remained was just money and memories of being someone who'd once mattered. His phone buzzed again. Another text, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "The documents have been filed. As of 9:47 p.m., you are legally separated from Vivian Hart, and share transfers will process tomorrow morning. Congratulations on your new beginning. DK." Grant read it twice before understanding that Damon Klein had just delivered the final blow with a politeness that made it cut deeper. New beginning. As if this were something to celebrate rather than mourn. The car pulled up to the Riverside Mansion, the house he'd bought 15 years ago as proof of his success. The home he'd filled with expensive furniture and art, and all the markers of achievement. Lights were on inside, which meant Vivian had already been here, already packed, already moved on to whatever came next. He went inside anyway, walked through rooms that felt like a museum of his own life, and finally made it to his study. The bar cart held scotch that was older than his marriage and probably worth more. He poured himself a glass, drank it standing at the window overlooking the manicured gardens, and tried to figure out how he'd missed every sign, every warning, every indication that his wife was capable of the absolute destruction he'd just witnessed. The answer came to him somewhere around the third glass of scotch, standing in the study that had always been his sanctuary, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt like props in a play he'd stopped understanding. He'd missed the signs because he'd stopped seeing Vivian as a person capable of independent thought or action. She'd become furniture in his life, elegant, expensive, appropriately placed, but fundamentally static. He'd stopped considering that she might have her own goals, her own intelligence, her own capacity for strategic thinking that could match or exceed his own. That arrogance, that blindness, had been his fatal flaw. His phone lit up with incoming messages. The first few were from business associates offering carefully worded sympathy that couldn't quite hide their schadenfreude. Then came messages from people he'd considered friends, casual acquaintances really, relationships built on mutual advantage rather than genuine connection. All of them suddenly very busy, unable to meet for their usual golf games or lunch meetings, citing schedule conflicts with a transparency that would have been insulting if Grant had any pride left to wound. The social exile was already beginning, and it wasn't even midnight. One message stood out from Marcus Webb, his college roommate, and one of the few people Grant had maintained actual friendship with over the years. Just saw the news. Holy hell, man. Call me if you need to talk. I'm around. Grant almost called him, thumb hovering over the number, but stopped himself. What would he say? That his wife had outsmarted him? That he'd been so arrogant he'd never considered she might fight back? That he'd thrown away 23 years for someone he didn't even love, just because she'd made him feel powerful and desired in ways Vivian had stopped providing? The truth was too pathetic to speak aloud. Instead, Grant poured another scotch and pulled up the news on his phone. The story had already broken, social media ablaze with photos from the gala, breathless accounts from people who'd been in the ballroom, speculation about what this meant for Halston Industries and Crown City's business landscape. The Crown City Chronicle's Society reporter had posted a thread that already had thousands of shares. Breaking. In the most spectacular public divorce announcement in Crown City history, Vivian Hart just took down her cheating husband Grant Halston at the Horizon Hope Gala. She revealed his affair, documented his financial improprieties, and announced she's now majority owner of his company. Thread follows with details. The subsequent posts detailed everything. The $5 million donation, Lola's humiliation on stage, the text messages read aloud. Grant's hasty exit from the ballroom. Someone had even posted a shaky video of Vivian's speech, her voice clear and strong as she systematically destroyed him. Grant watched himself get annihilated in real time across multiple platforms, the story spreading like wildfire through Crown City's social ecosystem and beyond. By morning, it would be national news. By afternoon, international. His destruction was being packaged and consumed as entertainment, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. A new text arrived from Damon Klein. Vivian has arranged for a moving company to pack your personal belongings tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please provide a forwarding address by midnight tonight. You will not be present during packing. Items will be delivered within 48 hours. Not be present in his own house, except it wasn't his house anymore. The settlement had awarded the Riverside Mansion to Vivian as part of the asset division. Another detail Grant had been too shell-shocked to fully process when signing the papers. He had nowhere to go. The downtown apartment was out. That was evidence of his infidelity, tainted by association with Lola. And besides, Vivian almost certainly had it earmarked for closure as part of unwinding his shell corporation. Hotels felt too temporary, too much like admission that he'd been completely displaced from his own life. Friends, the few real ones he had, were either married to women who'd side with Vivian out of solidarity or principle, or were professional contacts who'd already started distancing themselves. Grant texted back a single word. Where? Damon's response came within seconds, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this question. The Meridian Corporate Suites on Fifth Avenue have executive apartments available for extended stay. I've taken the liberty of reserving one in your name for 3 months, giving you time to find permanent housing. The account is paid through your settlement funds. Even in exile, Vivian had planned for his basic needs, anticipating his displacement and providing a solution before he'd thought to ask. The thoroughness of it was almost worse than outright cruelty would have been. Grant sent the Meridian's address to Damon and sat back down at his desk, staring at the computer screen that still showed his old calendar, his old meetings, his old life. Tomorrow morning, the share transfer would process. By 9 a.m., Vivian would officially control Halston Industries. The company he'd built from nothing would answer to someone else. What would she do with it? Change the name, probably. She'd already signaled that with her comment about the newly renamed Hartwell Dominion in some interview he'd glimpsed scrolling through social media. Restructure the leadership, bring in her own people, make decisions he'd never agree with. His life's work would be reshaped according to someone else's vision, and he'd have no say in it whatsoever. The injustice of it burned in his chest, warring with the exhaustion and shame and dawning recognition that maybe, just maybe, he'd brought this entirely on himself. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, not a text. Lola's name lit up the screen. Grant stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Hello? Grant. Her voice was thick with tears, ragged with crying. I don't know what to do. I can't go home. There are reporters outside my building. My boss called, said I should take some time off, which basically means I'm fired. My mother won't stop calling, and I can't tell her what happened because she'll... Lola, Grant interrupted, too tired for this, too empty to provide comfort he didn't feel. What do you want me to do about it? Silence on the other end, broken only by her sharp intake of breath. I thought you'd help me. I thought we were in this together. We were never in anything together, Grant said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended, but true, nonetheless. You were someone I spent time with, that's all. I never promised you more than that. You said you loved me. Her voice cracked. You said Vivian didn't understand you, that I made you feel alive, that you were going to leave her eventually. I lied. The admission felt like lancing a wound, painful but necessary. I said what you wanted to hear because it made things easier. I'm sorry if you believed it, but that's not my problem anymore. Another silence, longer this time. When Lola spoke again, her voice had changed from pleading to something colder, harder. You're a coward, she said, and Vivian was right about you. You don't actually care about anyone except yourself. I was stupid to think you saw me as anything more than a toy you could play with when you got bored. Probably, Grant agreed, because what else was there to say? I'm meeting with Damon Klein tomorrow, Lola said. I'm going to tell him everything, every conversation, every expense, every detail. Whatever deal Vivian offered me, I'm taking it, because at least she was honest about what she wanted. You just lied and lied and lied until someone finally called you on it. She hung up before Grant could respond, leaving him holding a dead phone and contemplating the reality that everyone in his life was actively working to ensure his complete destruction. He should have felt angry, betrayed, outraged that Lola would turn on him so quickly, that his wife had orchestrated such a comprehensive takedown, that the world he'd built was crumbling around him. Instead, he felt nothing except a hollow exhaustion and the distant recognition that this was what consequences looked like when they finally caught up. Grant made his way upstairs to the master bedroom, half expecting to find it stripped of Vivian's belongings already, but everything remained exactly as it had been that morning. Her closet still held her clothes, organized by color and season with the precision she brought to everything. Her vanity still displayed the jewelry she didn't consider special enough to warrant the safe. The photograph on her nightstand still showed the two of them at their 10th anniversary party, smiling like people who might actually love each other. He picked up the frame, studying the image with the disconnection of someone examining strangers. That Grant had been 41, still relatively young, still hungry, but not yet completely consumed by his own ambition. That Vivian had been 36, beautiful and gracious, and still willing to look at him with something like affection. When had that changed? When had the warmth in her eyes been replaced by polite distance? When had she stopped reaching for him in bed, stopped initiating conversations that went deeper than logistics and scheduling? The answer, Grant realized with uncomfortable clarity, was that he'd stopped noticing long before she'd stopped trying. He'd been too busy building his empire, chasing the next deal, proving himself to people whose opinions didn't actually matter. And Vivian, accommodating as always, had simply adjusted to his absence, filling her life with other pursuits, other relationships, other sources of meaning. He'd thought that meant she didn't care, that she'd accepted the terms of their marriage as transactional. He provided status and wealth. She provided social legitimacy and appropriate decoration for his life. But she'd been building something too. Not an empire of buildings and deals, but a network of alliances and connections. A foundation of goodwill and strategic relationships that she'd called upon when the time came to dismantle everything he'd created. She'd been patient, methodical, absolutely ruthless when pushed beyond her limits. Just like him, actually. Exactly like him. She'd learned from the master and then surpassed him, using his own playbook against him with devastating effectiveness. Grant set the photograph back down and moved to his own closet, pulling out a suitcase he hadn't used since his last actual business trip months ago. He packed mechanically, suits, shirts, toiletries, the basics he'd need for the Meridian corporate suites. Everything else could be dealt with later, boxed up by strangers and delivered to whatever temporary residence would house him until he figured out what came next. If anything came next. The question of what he'd do now hovered at the edges of his consciousness, too large and terrifying to examine directly. He was 52 years old, suddenly unemployed in any meaningful sense, socially exiled, and infamous for all the wrong reasons. The skills that had built his empire, ruthless negotiation, strategic risk-taking, the ability to identify and exploit weakness, seemed suddenly useless in a world where his reputation preceded him like a biohazard warning. Who would hire Grant Halston now? What board would welcome him? What business partner would trust him after he'd been so publicly exposed as a liar and cheat? He could try to start over somewhere else, some city that didn't know or care about Crown City society drama. But that felt like retreat, like admission of defeat, and Grant had spent his entire life refusing to accept limitation or loss. Except he'd lost. Completely. Irreversibly. And no amount of refusal would change that fundamental reality. Grant finished packing and carried his suitcase downstairs, setting it by the front door for the morning. The house felt different now, less like home and more like a space he was haunting, present but no longer belonging. He returned to the study, poured one more scotch, his last drink in this house, in this life, and sat at his desk, contemplating the computer screen that still showed tomorrow's calendar full of meetings he'd never attend, appointments he'd never keep, a schedule for a person who no longer existed. His email inbox held hundreds of new messages, most of them from reporters requesting comment, business associates trying to gauge the damage, a few genuine expressions of concern buried among the rest. Grant scrolled through them without reading, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attention his destruction had generated. One email stood out, though, sent just 20 minutes ago, from an address he didn't recognize, vhart.personal@heartmail.com. Vivian had sent him a message. Grant's finger hovered over the mouse, uncertain whether opening it would bring closure or just more pain. But curiosity, the same quality that had driven him to build an empire and destroy a marriage, won out. The message was short, just 3 paragraphs, but each word felt weighted with careful consideration. Grant, by the time you read this, the documents will be filed and our legal separation will be official. I want you to understand that nothing I did tonight was impulsive or emotional. I've been planning this for 7 months, and every decision was made carefully, with full awareness of the consequences. I'm not writing to gloat or to continue hurting you. I'm writing because I want you to know something important. I didn't do this because I hate you. I did it because I finally loved myself more than I feared being alone. You taught me many things during our marriage, including how to identify weakness and exploit it strategically. You just never imagined I'd use those skills against you. I hope you find whatever you're looking for in your next chapter. I genuinely do. But you need to understand that you'll never find it by making someone else smaller to make yourself feel bigger. That's the lesson here, if you're capable of learning it. Take care of yourself, Grant. This is goodbye. V. Grant read it 3 times, searching for hidden meaning, for subtext, for anything beyond the plain truth of what she'd written. But there was nothing to find. Vivian had said exactly what she meant with the same clarity and directness she'd brought to destroying him at the gala. She didn't hate him. She just didn't need him anymore. And somehow, that felt worse than hatred would have. He closed the email without responding, because what was there to say? Sorry felt insufficient and insincere. Anger felt impotent. Attempts at justification or explanation would only prove her point about his inability to accept responsibility. So he said nothing. Did nothing, just sat in the study until the scotch was gone and the sky outside began to lighten with the approach of dawn. At 6 a.m., Grant's phone buzzed with an alert from his bank. The share transfer had processed. Vivian Hart now owned 51% of Halston Industries, with control over all major corporate decisions and strategic direction. At 6:15, he received an email from the company's board of directors, a board that now answered to Vivian's majority vote, informing him that an emergency meeting had been called for 9 a.m. to discuss leadership transitions and strategic restructuring in light of recent ownership changes. At 6:30, the first moving trucks arrived at the Riverside mansion. Grant watched from the study window as uniformed workers began unloading boxes and supplies, preparing to pack up his life under Vivian's instructions while he was required to be elsewhere. At 6:45, his driver texted that he was outside, ready to transport Grant to the Meridian Corporate Suites. Grant took one last walk through the house, trailing his fingers along walls he'd never touch again, through rooms full of furniture that would soon belong to his ex-wife, past windows overlooking gardens that someone else would enjoy. The master bedroom, the kitchen where he'd never actually cooked but had enjoyed breakfast prepared by their longtime housekeeper, the formal dining room where they'd hosted countless dinner parties for people who were probably celebrating his downfall right now. He stopped in the foyer, standing beside his single suitcase, and looked up at the grand staircase, the chandelier that cost $40,000, the marble floor imported from Italy.
All the markers of success that had seemed so important, that he'd worked so hard to acquire. None of it mattered without power to back it up. Without control, it was just expensive decoration. Grant picked up his suitcase and walked out of the house without looking back, because looking back would require acknowledging what he'd lost, and he wasn't ready for that yet. The Meridian Corporate Suites occupied a gleaming tower in Crown City's financial district, all glass and steel efficiency designed for executives in transition between positions or cities. The apartment Damon had reserved was on the 23rd floor, high enough for impressive views, low enough to avoid the premium pricing of the top floors, and came fully furnished with the kind of generic corporate luxury that could belong to anyone or no one. Grant unpacked his single suitcase into the bedroom closet and surveyed his new domain. Living room with leather furniture and abstract art chosen to be inoffensive. Kitchen with high-end appliances he'd never use. Bathroom with marble countertops and rainfall shower. Bedroom with a king-size bed and blackout curtains. Everything a successful executive might need for a temporary stay. Except this wasn't temporary. This was his life now. At 8 a.m., his phone rang. Marcus Webb, the college friend who'd offered to talk. "You actually answered," Marcus said when Grant picked up. "Wasn't sure you would." "I'm not sure why I did," Grant admitted, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Crown City's skyline. "If you're calling to tell me I'm an idiot, I already know. I'm calling because we've been friends for 30 years, and I figured you might need someone to talk to who isn't a lawyer or a reporter." Marcus paused. "Also because Sarah made me promise to check on you. She's worried you might do something stupid." Sarah was Marcus's wife, a woman Grant had always liked despite seeing her only at occasional social functions. She was practical, kind, and had never seemed impressed by his wealth or status, qualities he'd found refreshing when he'd bothered to notice them. "Tell Sarah I'm fine," Grant said, though both of them knew it was a lie. "You're not fine. You just got publicly destroyed by your wife in front of everyone who matters in Crown City. That's the opposite of fine." Marcus's voice held sympathy, but also something firmer, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis the patient didn't want to hear. "The question is what you do next." "I don't know," Grant said, surprised by his own honesty. "I genuinely don't know. Well, for starters, you don't do what you usually do, which is bulldoze forward pretending nothing bothers you while secretly planning how to destroy whoever got in your way. That's what got you into this mess." "Thanks for the insight," Grant said dryly. "I'm serious, man. I've watched you operate for 3 decades. You're brilliant at business, terrible at people, and you've spent your entire adult life proving that you're smarter and tougher than everyone else. But Vivian just proved that when you push someone far enough, they push back harder than you ever expected." Grant said nothing, because Marcus was right, and they both knew it. "So, here's my advice," Marcus continued. "Actually learn something from this. Figure out why you torched a 23-year marriage for someone you don't even love. Deal with whatever drove you to need constant validation from new conquests. And maybe, just maybe, try being an actual human being instead of a walking corporate strategy." "You done?" Grant asked. "For now. Call me if you need anything real. Otherwise, I'll check in next week." Marcus hung up, leaving Grant alone with observations that cut too close to truth for comfort. At 9 a.m., Grant's phone lit up with notifications as the board meeting began without him. He watched the real-time updates roll in. Appointment of an interim CEO to handle day-to-day operations while Vivian established strategic direction. Announcement of a comprehensive corporate audit to identify any additional financial irregularities. Formation of a committee to review all major contracts and partnerships signed in the past 3 years. Vivian was moving fast, establishing control and cleaning house before anyone could mount opposition or question her authority. She'd learned well, strike decisively, consolidate power, remake the organization in your image before resistance could organize. By 10 a.m., the news had gone national. Major business publications were running stories about the spectacular public divorce, analyzing what it meant for corporate governance and gender dynamics in executive leadership. Some framed Vivian as a feminist hero taking down a cheating executive. Others questioned the ethics of her public takedown. All of them agreed it was the most dramatic boardroom coup Crown City had seen in decades. Grant's phone rang again. This time it was Robert Chen, one of Halston Industries' major clients, and someone Grant had considered a friend as much as a business partner. "Grant,"
Robert said when he answered, his voice carefully neutral. I'm calling as a courtesy to let you know that we're reviewing all our contracts with Halston Industries. Given the transition in leadership and the questions around financial management, our legal team has advised us to consider our options. You're pulling your business, Grant translated. We're evaluating our position, Robert corrected, though the distinction was meaningless. I wanted to tell you personally before you heard it elsewhere. It's not personal, Grant. It's just prudent business practice given the circumstances. Of course, Grant said, keeping his voice even. I understand completely. I'm sorry it ended this way, Robert added, and he might have even meant it. You built something impressive with Halston Industries. I hope things work out for you. They both knew they wouldn't, but Grant appreciated the polite fiction anyway. The calls continued throughout the morning. Clients reconsidering partnerships, vendors requesting new payment guarantees, professional contacts suddenly very busy. The entire ecosystem that had supported Grant's empire was carefully, politely, distancing itself from the wreckage. By noon, Grant had received 17 similar calls and stopped answering his phone entirely. By 2 p.m., the moving company had delivered his belongings to the Meridian, 37 boxes containing the material remnants of his life in the Riverside mansion. Grant stared at them stacked in his new living room and couldn't summon the energy to start unpacking. By 4 p.m., exhaustion finally overrode the anxiety and shame enough that he collapsed on the bed fully clothed and fell into dreamless sleep. He woke to darkness and the disorienting sensation of not knowing where he was. The Meridian's bedroom looked nothing like his room at the Riverside mansion, and for several panicked seconds Grant thought he might be in a hotel, that maybe the past 24 hours had been some horrible nightmare. Then memory returned with crushing weight. The gala, Vivian's speech, the documents he'd signed, the life he'd lost. His phone showed 11 p.m. and dozens of missed calls, none of which he wanted to return. The news cycle had moved on to analyzing Vivian's first official statements as majority owner of Halston Industries. She'd given a press conference at 3 p.m. that Grant had slept through, announcing her vision for the company's future. Grant pulled up the video, unable to resist seeing what she'd said. Vivian looked radiant and completely in control, dressed in a charcoal suit that projected authority without aggression, standing behind a podium with the Halston Industries logo, soon to be changed, visible behind her. Thank you all for being here, she began, her voice strong and clear. I know there's been a lot of speculation about what yesterday's events mean for Halston Industries and its future direction. I want to address that directly. She paused, making eye contact with reporters, commanding the room with the same presence she'd brought to destroying Grant at the gala. Halston Industries has always been a company focused on profit maximization above all else. That focus built an impressive portfolio and generated significant returns, but it also created a culture where corners were cut, where workers were treated as disposable resources, where community impact was an afterthought if it was considered at all. Grant felt his jaw tighten. She was criticizing his life's work on national television, reframing his achievements as moral failures. Under my leadership, Vivian continued, we're going to maintain our commitment to excellence and profitability, but we're also going to prioritize sustainability, ethical labor practices, and genuine community investment. We're going to prove that you can build wealth while also building value for everyone, employees, communities, stakeholders, not just shareholders. A reporter shouted a question. Ms. Hart, critics say you're using the company to make a political statement about your divorce. How do you respond? Vivian smiled slightly. I'd say those critics fundamentally misunderstand what happened yesterday. I didn't take control of Halston Industries to make a statement about my marriage. I took control because I'd spent 7 months systematically acquiring the means to do so, and I intend to use that control to build something better than what existed before. My personal life and my business decisions are separate matters. What about Grant Halston's role going forward? Mr. Halston retains a minority share in the company and will receive appropriate distributions according to his ownership stake. Beyond that, he has no operational role or strategic input. We wish him well in his future endeavors. The dismissal was absolute and public. Grant Halston, who'd built the company from nothing, reduced to a footnote in someone else's vision. The press conference continued, Vivian fielding questions with practiced ease, outlining restructuring plans, announcing new initiatives, presenting herself as exactly what she was, A competent leader who'd been underestimated for far too long and was now making sure everyone understood their mistake. Grant watched until he couldn't anymore, then threw his phone across the room where it bounced off the expensive couch and landed somewhere he couldn't see. He sat in the darkness of his temporary apartment, surrounded by boxes he hadn't unpacked, and finally, for the first time since Vivian had taken that stage at the Orchid Palace Hotel, allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just the company or the house or the status, though those losses were real and devastating. He'd lost Vivian, the woman who'd stood beside him for 23 years, who'd opened doors and smoothed paths and believed in him when he was still building his empire. He'd taken her for granted so thoroughly that he'd never considered she might have her own strength, her own intelligence, her own capacity for decisive action. And when she'd finally had enough, when she'd finally fought back, she'd done it with a precision and ruthlessness that he had to admire even as it destroyed him. Grant retrieved his phone from wherever it had landed and pulled up Vivian's email again, reading her closing words one more time. You'll never find it by making someone else smaller to make yourself feel bigger. That was the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Every deal he'd celebrated had left someone else defeated. Every accomplishment had required someone else's failure. He'd built his empire on the principle of winners and losers, and he'd made damn sure he was always on the winning side. Until he'd pushed the one person who actually mattered, and she'd shown him what losing really looked like. The question now was whether he could learn from it, or whether he'd spend the rest of his life being exactly what he'd always been, just with less power and money to insulate him from the consequences. Grant spent the next 3 weeks in a fog of shame and forced introspection that felt like walking through broken glass. The days blurred together in the Meridian's sterile comfort. He'd wake around noon, order food he barely tasted, scroll through news coverage of his downfall, and go back to sleep. The boxes from the Riverside mansion remained mostly unpacked, monuments to a life he couldn't bring himself to fully inhabit or completely abandon. Marcus called every few days, checking in with the persistence of someone who'd decided intervention was worth risking. Friendship. Sarah sent care packages, actual physical boxes of homemade cookies and soup, as if Grant were recovering from surgery rather than social suicide. He appreciated the gestures even as they made him feel pathetic, like someone who needed to be looked after because he couldn't manage basic self-care. The press coverage eventually shifted from scandal to analysis, think pieces about corporate governance and gender dynamics in business leadership. Vivian became a symbol, feminist icon to some, ruthless opportunist to others, while Grant became a cautionary tale about hubris and entitlement. His Wikipedia page now led with the divorce before mentioning any of his actual business accomplishments, as if destroying his marriage had become his defining achievement. The financial reality of his new life settled in with uncomfortable clarity. The settlement left him wealthy by any objective measure. His 25% stake in what was rapidly being renamed Hartwell Dominion was worth millions, and the structured payout Vivian had agreed to meant he'd receive substantial quarterly distributions. But wealthy wasn't the same as powerful, and Grant was discovering that power had been the drug he'd actually been addicted to all along. Money without control felt hollow. He could buy anything he wanted except influence, respect, or relevance. On a Wednesday morning, exactly 23 days after the gala, Grant woke to find an email from Damon Klein with the subject line, Final Settlement Distribution and Closure. The message was characteristically brief and professional, outlining the completion of all asset transfers, the finalization of divorce proceedings, and the official severing of all legal ties between Grant and Vivian Halston. Except she wasn't Vivian Halston anymore. The documents referred to her as Vivian Hart throughout, reclaiming the family name she'd temporarily surrendered when they married. Even in paperwork, she was erasing him from her identity. The email included one final attachment, a statement from Vivian's personal attorney, separate from the divorce proceedings, informing Grant that Vivian had exercised her right as majority shareholder to remove him from the Hartwell Dominion Board of Directors entirely. He'd retain his ownership stake and receive his distributions, but he'd have zero input into company operations or strategic direction. Grant read the notification 3 times, searching for loopholes or opportunities to challenge the decision, before accepting that Vivian had covered every angle. The corporate bylaws she now controlled gave majority shareholders absolute authority over board composition. She'd used his own rules against him, exploiting provisions he'd written to protect his control. never imagining they'd be wielded by someone else. His phone rang. Robert Chen again, the client who'd called to review their contracts 3 weeks ago. Grant, I wanted to let you know personally, we've decided to continue our relationship with Hartwell Dominion. Vivian's team reached out with some proposals that address our concerns about sustainability and community impact, and we're moving forward with an expanded partnership. That's good, Grant managed, though it felt like swallowing glass. I'm glad it worked out. She's impressive, Robert continued, seemingly oblivious to how each word landed like a punch. I'll admit, I had concerns about the leadership transition, but she's proven herself in just 3 weeks. The strategic vision she's outlining is actually more ambitious than what Halston Industries had been pursuing. Wonderful, Grant said flatly. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for building something solid enough to survive the transition. Whatever else happened, you created a strong foundation. Vivian's just taking it in a different direction. The consolation prize of being acknowledged for past achievements while being completely irrelevant to future success felt worse than being forgotten entirely. After Robert hung up, Grant finally started unpacking the boxes that had been sitting in his living room for 3 weeks. The physical activity gave him something to do besides spiral, and the act of putting things away felt like accepting that this apartment wasn't temporary. It was his life now. The boxes contained the expected items, clothes, books, personal effects, but also artifacts of his marriage that someone on the packing crew had included, probably without realizing their significance. Wedding photos in expensive frames. Anniversary gifts Vivian had given him over the years. A leather-bound journal she'd presented him on their 10th anniversary with the inscription, "For capturing the next decade of adventures together." Grant opened the journal to find it completely blank. He'd never written a single word in it, had probably thanked Vivian graciously, and then forgotten about it entirely, too busy with work and ambition to bother documenting his life. He set it aside and continued unpacking, finding more evidence of the marriage he'd neglected, ticket stubs from shows they'd attended together in the early years, before he'd started finding excuses to skip cultural events in favor of networking dinners. A photo album Vivian had assembled for their 5th anniversary, filled with images of them looking genuinely happy, back when touching each other had been natural rather than performative. The last box contained something that made Grant stop completely, a small wooden box he recognized immediately. Vivian's grandmother had given it to her as a wedding gift, an heirloom that had been passed down through Hart family women for 4 generations. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Vivian's elegant handwriting on expensive stationery. Grant opened the first one, dated from their 2nd anniversary. My darling Grant, I know you don't remember, but 2 years ago today you promised to build a life with me that honored both our dreams, not just your ambitions. I'm writing this as a reminder to myself that the man I married is still in there somewhere, underneath the drive and determination. I believe in you, even when you forget to believe in us. All my love, V. The second letter was from their 5th anniversary. Grant, another year of watching you chase success like it's the only thing that matters. I'm proud of what you're building, but I miss the man who used to ask about my day, who cared about more than business and status. I'm still here, still hoping you'll remember why we started this journey together. I love you, even when you make it difficult. V. The letters continued, one for each anniversary, charting the slow deterioration of their marriage through Vivian's increasingly desperate attempts to reach him. By their 15th anniversary, the tone had shifted from hopeful to resigned. Grant, I don't think you'll read this, just like you didn't read the others. I found them yesterday while looking for something else, all stacked in this box exactly as I'd left them. 14 years of trying to connect with you, and you never once opened a single letter. I should probably stop writing them, but maybe I'm writing to myself now, documenting the death of something I once believed in. I don't know if I love you anymore, or if I just love the memory of who you used to be. V. The most recent letter was from their 20th anniversary, 3 years before the affair with Lola began. Grant, this is the last letter I'll write to you. Not because I'm giving up, but because I've finally accepted that you are exactly who you've always been. And I was the fool who kept expecting you to change. You married me for my connections and my family name. I married you because I thought you'd grow into someone who valued more than power and money. We were both wrong about who the other person was. I don't hate you for it. I just don't have anything left to give to someone who never wanted what I had to offer in the first place. This is goodbye to the marriage I imagined we'd have. What comes next is just logistics and appearances. I'll play my role perfectly because that's what heart women do. But the real marriage ended today, whether you realize it or not. V. Grant read that final letter 4 times, each pass revealing new layers of pain he'd been too blind or too selfish to see while it was happening. Vivian had been mourning their marriage for 3 years before he'd even noticed something was wrong. She'd tried for 20 years to reach him, and he'd been so consumed with his own pursuits that he'd never once opened a letter she'd poured her heart into. The wooden box also contained one more item, a single sheet of paper, not a letter, dated the day after the gala. Vivian's handwriting was as elegant as ever, but the message was brief. Grant, I'm leaving these letters with your belongings so you'll understand that what happened at the Orchid Palace wasn't sudden or impulsive. I gave you 20 years to see me as a person rather than an accessory. You never did. Everything that followed was consequence, not cruelty. I hope someday you understand the difference. Be well. V. Grant set the letters down carefully, as if they were evidence in a trial he was finally ready to acknowledge he'd lost. All those years, Vivian had been trying to save their marriage while he'd been too busy building an empire to notice she was drowning right beside him. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Sarah's making dinner Sunday. You should come. Actual food, actual people, actual conversation. Don't make me kidnap you. Grant almost declined, then stopped himself. Sitting alone in his apartment reading letters from his ex-wife about all the ways he'd failed her wasn't helping anything. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe what he needed was to try being an actual human being instead of a walking corporate strategy. He texted back, "What time?" Marcus's response was immediate, 6 p.m. And Grant? Come ready to actually talk. We're done pretending everything's fine. Sunday arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, Crown City's trees just beginning to show hints of gold and red. Grant drove himself to Marcus and Sarah's house in the suburbs, a sprawling colonial that managed to feel welcoming rather than ostentatious, and sat in the driveway for 5 minutes trying to convince himself to go inside. The front door opened before he could retreat, Sarah standing on the porch with a knowing smile. I saw you pull up 10 minutes ago. Are you planning to sit in your car all evening, or are you going to come inside like a normal person? Still deciding, Grant admitted, climbing out of the car with the enthusiasm of someone heading to their own execution. Sarah crossed her arms, assessing him with the directness that had always slightly unnerved him. She was a family therapist by trade, which meant she saw through social performances better than most people. You look terrible. When's the last time you slept properly? Define properly. More than 3 hours at a time without the assistance of alcohol. Grant couldn't remember, which was probably answer enough. Sarah sighed and gestured him inside. The house smelled like roasting chicken and fresh bread, homey and comforting in a way that made Grant's sterile apartment feel even more depressing by comparison. Marcus appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that said Grill Sergeant and carrying a beer. You actually came, Marcus said, handing Grant the bottle. I had money on you canceling. Sarah would have kidnapped me, Grant replied, accepting the beer and taking a long drink. Damn right I would have, Sarah confirmed, leading them toward the living room. Sit, talk. We'll eat in 20 minutes, but first we're doing the intervention I've been planning since the gala. Grant nearly turned around and left right then, but Marcus put a hand on his shoulder with enough pressure to convey that running wasn't an option. They sat, Grant on the couch, Marcus and Sarah in matching armchairs that faced him like therapists preparing for a difficult session. So, Sarah began without preamble, how are you actually doing? I'm fine, Grant said automatically. Try again, this time with honesty. Grant took another drink of beer, buying time to figure out how to answer a question he'd spent 3 weeks avoiding. I don't know how to be irrelevant, he finally said. Everything I built, everything I was, it's all gone, or belongs to someone else. I wake up every day with nothing to do and nowhere to be, and I don't know who I am without the company and the power and the position. Sarah nodded, like he'd confirmed something she'd suspected. That's actually progress, admitting you don't know. Most people in your situation would still be pretending they're fine while their lives fall apart. My life already fell apart, past tense. No, Sarah corrected gently. Your old life ended. Whether your new life falls apart or becomes something different is still up to you.
Easy for you to say. You didn't lose everything. You didn't lose everything, Marcus cut in. You lost your company and your marriage and your status. Those aren't small things, but they're not everything. You still have your health, your intelligence, enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And friends who are apparently gluttons for punishment because we're still here. Friends who are about to tell me everything I did wrong? Grant asked with more bitterness than he'd intended. Friends who are going to tell you the truth because nobody else will, Sarah said. You want to know what I thought when I heard about the gala? My first reaction wasn't surprise at what Vivian did. It was surprise that she waited so long to do it. That landed like a slap. You knew? About Lola? Everyone knew, Grant, or at least suspected. You weren't nearly as discreet as you thought you were. Downtown apartment, mysterious schedule changes, the way you looked at Lola at that fundraiser last spring, it was obvious to anyone paying attention. And nobody said anything? Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look that held entire conversations. What were we supposed to say? Marcus asked. You were so convinced you had everything under control, so certain that Vivian would never leave because she needed you too much. Trying to warn you would have been pointless, and honestly, it wasn't our marriage to save. But we did talk to Vivian, Sarah added quietly. Grant's head snapped up. What? About 6 months ago. She called me, said she needed advice about something personal. We met for coffee, and she told me everything, the affair, the years of feeling invisible, the decision she'd already made to divorce you. She asked me if I thought she was being vindictive for planning to make it public. What did you tell her? Grant's voice came out hoarse. I told her that vindictive would be doing it quietly and taking you for everything in court. What she was planning was accountability, making sure you couldn't spin the narrative, couldn't make yourself the victim, couldn't walk away without consequences. Sarah's expression held sympathy, but also something firmer, like a surgeon who knows the treatment will hurt but is necessary anyway. I also told her that if she was sure about the divorce, she should protect herself financially, because you'd use every resource available to maintain control. So you helped her, Grant said, not quite a question. I supported my friend who was being betrayed by her husband. Yes. Sarah's voice held no apology. And before you ask, I don't regret it. Vivian spent 20 years making herself smaller for you. She deserved to have someone in her corner when she finally decided to take up space. The truth of it sat between them, unavoidable and damning. Grant had been so isolated in his arrogance that even his closest friends had sided with his wife, had seen her as the victim deserving support, while he'd been the problem to manage. I read her letters, Grant said quietly. The ones she wrote me every anniversary. 20 letters I never opened, never read, never even acknowledged. She tried for 20 years to reach me, and I never noticed because I was too busy proving I was smarter than everyone else. Sarah's expression softened slightly. That's the first genuinely self-aware thing I've heard you say in years. Doesn't change anything, though, does it? She's gone, the company's gone, everything's gone, and knowing why doesn't fix it. No, Marcus agreed. But it's the first step toward maybe not making the same mistakes in whatever comes next. You want to know what I think your real problem is? I'm sure you're going to tell me. You've spent your entire adult life trying to prove you're worth something because you came from nothing. Your dad's business failed. You grew up without money or connections, and you built everything through sheer determination to show the world you mattered. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. But you never figured out how to matter to yourself, separate from the achievements and status. So you kept chasing bigger deals, more power, higher positions, trying to fill a hole that success could never actually fill. Grant wanted to argue, to dismiss it as pop psychology nonsense, but the accuracy of it stung too much to deny. And Vivian, Sarah added, represented everything you thought you needed. Old money, social connections, the legitimacy of the Hart family name. You married her for what she could give you, and when she stopped being useful in that way, when she started wanting an actual partnership instead of being a beautiful accessory, you got bored and went looking for someone who'd make you feel powerful again. Lola didn't make me feel powerful, Grant said. She made me feel wanted. Same thing for you, Sarah said gently. Being wanted meant being valuable, meant being powerful. You've always equated those things because you never learned to separate your worth as a person from your achievements and status. The kitchen timer went off, a sharp intrusion into the heavy conversation.
Sarah stood, touching Grant's shoulder as she passed. Dinner's ready. We can continue this over food, or we can talk about literally anything else. Your choice. They ate at the dining room table, the conversation shifting to safer topics. Marcus's work as a consultant, Sarah's practice, their daughter's college search process. Normal family concerns that felt simultaneously foreign and appealing to Grant. This was what marriage could look like when both people actually showed up for it. When power dynamics didn't poison every interaction, when being together was about more than strategic advantage. Can I ask you something? Grant said as Sarah was serving dessert, homemade apple pie that looked nothing like the perfect geometric creation served at Crown City's finest restaurants, but somehow felt more real. Did Vivian say anything about whether she's happy now? About how she's doing? Sarah considered the question carefully. I haven't talked to her since the gala. She's been fairly private since everything happened, focused on the company transition. But I saw her interviewed on that business news program last week, and she looked different. Different how? Lighter. Like she'd been carrying something heavy for years and finally set it down. She smiled more in that 20-minute interview than I'd seen her smile in the last 5 years of your marriage. Sarah paused, then added with careful honesty, I think she's relieved, Grant. Not happy in a celebrating way, but relieved that she doesn't have to pretend anymore. The assessment hurt precisely because it was probably true. Vivian wasn't mourning their marriage, she was celebrating her freedom from it. For what it's worth, Marcus said, I don't think she did it to hurt you, even though it did hurt you. I think she did it because it was the only way to make sure you actually faced consequences for once in your life. Mission accomplished, Grant said dryly. Is it though? Sarah asked, her therapist instincts clearly engaged. Have you actually faced the consequences? Or are you just sitting in your apartment feeling sorry for yourself while waiting for things to magically get better? What else am I supposed to do? I can't get my company back. I can't get my marriage back. I can't undo any of it. No, but you can figure out who you want to be going forward. You're 52 years old with enough money to do literally anything. You could go back to school, start a different kind of business, do consulting work, volunteer, travel, write a book about your experiences, become a mentor to young entrepreneurs. The options are endless, all of which sound meaningless without the power and status I used to have. Then you haven't learned anything, Sarah said bluntly. You're still measuring your worth by external validation instead of figuring out what actually matters to you as a human being. Grant had no response to that because she was absolutely right. He stayed until nearly 11, talking and drinking coffee, and letting Marcus and Sarah push him toward uncomfortable realizations about himself and his choices. When he finally left, Sarah walked him to his car and gave him a hug that lasted longer than was strictly necessary. You're not a bad person, Grant, she said quietly. You're just someone who's been operating from fear and insecurity for so long that you forgot how to be anything else. But you can learn, if you're willing to do the work. What kind of work? Therapy would be a good start, actual therapy, with someone who'll challenge you instead of telling you what you want to hear. Figure out why you need constant validation, why you equate love with power, why you can't value yourself without achievements to point to. That sounds awful. It will be, Sarah agreed cheerfully, but probably less awful than spending the rest of your life being exactly who you've always been while wondering why nothing feels meaningful. Grant drove back to the Meridian thinking about what Sarah had said, about power and worth, and the hole he'd been trying to fill with achievements that never quite satisfied. The letters from Vivian sat on his dining room table where he'd left them, physical evidence of opportunities missed and connections ignored. He opened his laptop and did something he hadn't done since college. Search for therapists in Crown City who specialized in executive counseling and life transitions. The irony of needing professional help to figure out how to be a person wasn't lost on him. But Sarah was right about one thing. Whatever he'd been doing clearly wasn't working. 3 weeks later, Grant sat in Dr. Patricia Morrison's office for his 4th session, finally beginning to articulate things he'd spent 50 years avoiding. Dr. Morrison was in her 60s, impeccably professional, and completely unmoved by his attempts to charm or deflect. She'd listened to his story without judgment, but also without sympathy, treating his marriage collapse as data to analyze rather than drama to sympathize with. You've described what you lost, she said during that 4th session, her pen poised over her notepad. The company, the marriage, the status.
But what I'm not hearing is any description of what you actually want going forward. I want my life back, Grant said automatically. Your old life is gone. That's not an option. So what do you actually want in the life you're building now? The question stopped him cold because he genuinely didn't know.
Everything he'd wanted had been defined by external markers: money, power, respect, position. Strip those away, and he had no idea what was left. I don't know, he admitted finally. Then that's what we're going to figure out, Dr. Morrison said. Because until you know what you want separate from what other people think of you, you're just going to keep repeating the same patterns in different contexts. The work was harder than anything Grant had done in business. Examining his motivations, his fears, his desperate need for validation felt like emotional surgery without anesthesia. But slowly, painfully slowly, he began to understand the shape of his own damage. His father's business failure hadn't just been a financial setback, it had been a defining trauma that convinced young Grant that security was an illusion and power was the only protection against vulnerability. Every achievement since had been an attempt to prove he'd never be powerless like his father had been, never suffer the humiliation of failure and loss. Except he'd ended up losing anyway, and the fall had been so much farther because he'd built so high. What if, Dr. Morrison suggested during their 6th session, you considered the possibility that failure isn't actually the worst thing that can happen to a person? It destroyed my father. It ended his business. Did it destroy him as a person? Grant had to think about that. His father had died when Grant was in his 30s, bitter and disappointed but not actually destroyed. He'd found work, supported his family, lived a life that was smaller than he'd dreamed but not meaningless. He was never the same after, Grant said finally. That's different from being destroyed. People change after losses. Sometimes they become smaller, sometimes they become different. But change isn't the same as destruction. Grant sat with that, feeling something shift in his understanding of his own story. By his 8th session, he'd started to articulate something that felt almost like a goal. He wanted to matter to people in ways that didn't depend on what he could do for them or give them. He wanted relationships built on actual connection rather than strategic advantage. He wanted to be someone who added value to the world in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. That's good, Dr. Morrison said. Now the question is how you start building that kind of life. The answer, Grant was discovering, involved a lot of uncomfortable work and very little immediate gratification. But maybe that was the point. 6 months after the gala, Grant stood in front of a classroom of 20 undergraduate business students at Crown City Community College, feeling more nervous than he'd felt pitching to Fortune 500 CEOs. The students stared at him with varying degrees of interest and skepticism, waiting for whatever wisdom a disgraced executive might have to offer about entrepreneurship and ethics. "My name is Grant Halston," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "And 6 months ago, I lost everything I'd spent 30 years building because I was too arrogant to see that my wife was smarter than me, too selfish to value my marriage over my ego, and too blind to recognize that real power comes from integrity, not control." The room went completely silent. This wasn't the polished corporate speaker they'd been expecting. "I'm not here to teach you how to build a successful business," Grant continued. "There are plenty of people who can do that better than me. I'm here to tell you what happens when you build success on a foundation of arrogance, when you measure your worth entirely by external achievement, and when you treat people as resources to exploit rather than human beings deserving of respect." One student raised her hand, a young woman with sharp eyes and natural skepticism. "So you're saying we shouldn't be ambitious? That wanting success is wrong?" "No," Grant said. "I'm saying ambition without character is a time bomb. I'm saying that if you build an empire by making other people smaller, you're not actually building anything sustainable. You're just creating enemies who are waiting for their chance to take you down. And I'm saying that the skills that make you successful in business can destroy you in every other area of your life if you're not careful about when and how you use them." The lecture series had been Dr. Morrison's idea suggested during their 10th therapy session when Grant had admitted he had no idea what to do with his days beyond showing up for appointments and pretending to read books about personal growth. She'd connected him with a colleague who taught at the community college, and somehow Grant had found himself agreeing to teach a 6-week course on business ethics and leadership failures. The first two classes had been painful exercises in humility, standing in front of students young enough to be his children and admitting every mistake, every moral compromise, every choice that had seemed justified at the time but looked indefensible in retrospect. But by the third class, something had shifted. The students had stopped seeing him as a cautionary tale and started engaging with the material, asking questions that challenged Grant to articulate principles he was still figuring out himself. Today's class focused on power dynamics in professional relationships, and Grant found himself talking about Vivian without the defensive anger that had characterized his early therapy sessions. "My ex-wife tried to tell me for 20 years that our marriage was failing," he said, pulling up the slide he'd prepared, a photograph of the wooden box containing Vivian's letters. "She wrote me letters every anniversary, pouring out her heart, trying to reach me. I never read a single one until after she'd divorced me and taken control of my company." "Why do you think that is?" Another student spoke up, a young man who'd been mostly quiet until now. "Because you didn't think you had to? Because she was supposed to accept whatever you gave her and be grateful for it?" "Exactly," Grant agreed, surprised by how much the blunt assessment didn't sting anymore. "I married Vivian because she gave me access to social circles I couldn't reach on my own. Her family connections opened doors, her name gave me legitimacy, her grace made me look better than I actually was. And I convinced myself that providing her with wealth and status was enough, that she should be satisfied with the lifestyle I gave her even if I never actually showed up as a partner." He paused, looking around the classroom. "How many of you have been in relationships where you felt invisible? Where the other person was so focused on their own goals that you felt like a supporting character in their story rather than an equal partner?" Almost every hand went up, including the professor's teaching assistant who'd been taking notes in the back. "That's what I did to Vivian for 23 years, Grant said. "And when she finally had enough and fought back, she used every skill I taught her: strategic thinking, long-term planning, identifying weakness, and exploiting it ruthlessly. She learned from watching me operate in business, and she applied those lessons to destroying me. And you know what? She was absolutely right to do it." The admission felt liberating rather than humiliating now. 6 months of therapy having worn down the defensive pride that had sustained him through the immediate aftermath of the divorce. "So what did you learn?" the skeptical young woman asked, "besides that your wife was smarter than you thought?" "I learned that power without accountability is just tyranny waiting to happen. I learned that treating people as means to an end guarantees they'll turn on you eventually. And I learned that success measured purely in money and status is hollow. It can all disappear overnight. And if that's all you have, you're left with nothing." The class ended with more questions than Grant had time to answer, students clustering around him afterward to continue the conversation. A young man named David, who'd been particularly engaged throughout the course, approached after the others had left. "Mr. Halston, I wanted to ask, have you talked to your ex-wife at all since the divorce? Do you think there's any chance of reconciliation?" Grant considered the question carefully. "No, and there shouldn't be. Vivian spent 2 decades trying to build something real with me, and I threw it away because I took her for granted. She deserves better than someone who only appreciated her after losing her. The best thing I can do for her is leave her alone and hope she builds an amazing life without me in it." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's harder than trying to win her back would be." "Much harder," Grant agreed, "but it's also the right thing to do, which is a consideration I didn't used to prioritize." He was packing up his materials when his phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender name made his heart skip. Lola Reyes. Grant hadn't heard from Lola since that bitter phone call the night of the gala, when she'd told him she was cooperating with Vivian's attorneys. According to the legal documents Damon had sent months ago, Lola had provided comprehensive testimony about the affair, confirmed financial details, and fulfilled her obligations under the agreement Vivian had offered. The email's subject line was simple. "Coffee?" Grant opened it with trepidation. "Grant, I know this is unexpected, but I was hoping we could talk. Not about the past or the affair or any of that. I've spent the last 6 months in therapy dealing with my part in what happened, and I don't need to relitigate it. I want to talk about something professional. I have a business proposal I think you'd be interested in, and despite everything, I think you might be the right person to advise on it. Are you free next Tuesday?" Lola. The message was professional, direct, and completely unexpected. Grant read it 3 times, trying to parse hidden meanings or ulterior motives, before recognizing that he was falling back into old patterns, assuming everyone had an angle, that no interaction was straightforward, that trust was weakness. He texted Dr. Morrison. Ex-mistress wants to meet about a business proposal. Is this a terrible idea? Her response came within minutes. Depends. Are you meeting her to feel powerful again, or because you're genuinely curious about the proposal? Check your motives before you respond. Grant sat with that question for several hours, examining his instinctive desire to say yes and trying to identify whether it came from genuine interest or from ego-seeking validation. Finally, he responded to Lola. Tuesday at 2 p.m., the coffee shop on 5th and Market. This is purely professional. Her reply was immediate. Absolutely, thank you. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp spring weather that made Crown City beautiful, trees in full bloom and the sky that particular shade of blue that felt like promise. Grant arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, ordered plain black coffee, and claimed a table near the window where he could watch people passing by, a habit he'd developed over the past months, finding unexpected comfort in observing the small dramas of strangers' lives. Lola arrived exactly at 2, looking different than he remembered. She'd cut her hair into a sleek bob, traded the designer labels for understated professional attire, and carried herself with a confidence that seemed earned rather than performed. She'd grown up, Grant realized. 6 months ago, she'd been someone playing at sophistication. Now she looked like someone who'd been through fire and come out tempered by it. Grant, she said, extending her hand for a formal handshake. Thank you for meeting me. Lola. He shook her hand, noting that she held his gaze directly instead of looking away. You said you had a business proposal? She sat down, pulling out a tablet and setting it on the table between them. I do. But first I need to say something. I owe you an apology for my part in what happened. Not for cooperating with Vivian, that was the right thing to do, but for ever getting involved with you in the first place. I knew you were married. I told myself all kinds of stories about how it was different, how Vivian didn't understand you, how we had something special. But the truth is, I was using you for career advancement and excitement, and I let myself ignore the damage we were causing because it benefited me. The apology was unexpected and disarming in its directness. I appreciate you saying that, Grant said carefully. Though I should be clear, what happened wasn't your fault. You didn't seduce me away from a happy marriage. I pursued you because I was bored and arrogant and wanted to feel powerful. You were young and ambitious, and I exploited that. If anyone should be apologizing, it's me. We can both be sorry, Lola said with a slight smile. Vivian taught me that accountability isn't a competition. 2 people can both be responsible for their choices even if those choices hurt the same person. You've been talking to Vivian? The question came out sharper than Grant intended. I have, Lola confirmed. After I gave my testimony to Damon, Vivian reached out through her assistant and offered to meet with me. I almost didn't go. I was terrified she'd eviscerate me the way she'd destroyed you at the gala. But she didn't. She was direct and honest about what I'd done wrong, but she also helped me understand that one catastrophically bad decision didn't have to define my entire life. That sounds like Vivian.